All right, let's dive into one of the most brilliant and honestly brutal tactical victories in Scottish history. It is a fantastic story of rebellion, sheer arrogance, and how one single narrow bridge was turned into a devastating killing ground. This is the Battle of Stirling Bridge. So picture this, it's September 11th, 1297. You have this massive professional English army marching north to just stamp out a Scottish rebellion. Their path is blocked by the River Forth, and the only way across is this tiny little wooden bridge. Now here's the kicker. They have no idea that two Scottish leaders, William Wallace and Andrew de Moray, are just waiting for them on the other side, and they've cooked up a brutally simple plan. You know, the English commander, the Earl of Surrey, he was an old hand at this, a real veteran, and he was deeply, deeply uneasy about crossing this bridge. I mean, he could see the tactical nightmare laid out right in front of him, sending his incredibly powerful army over this bottleneck, maybe 2 horsemen at a time, all while a hostile army is watching from the high ground. He actually hesitated for days. He really should have trusted his gut. And let's be clear, this was not just some random river crossing. Stirling was, for all intents and purposes, the strategic heart of Scotland. It was like the brooch that pinned the Highlands and the Lowlands together. If you controlled Stirling and its bridge, you controlled the gateway to the entire north of the country. For the English, taking it was absolutely essential to crush the rebellion, and for the Scots, well, it was the perfect place to make a stand. So how did we even get here? I mean, how did Scotland and England, two nations that had actually been pretty peaceful for about a century, end up in this massive, full-scale war for independence? Well, the answer, like it so often is, lies in a tragic accident and one king's towering ambition. It all kicks off with a succession crisis. The Scottish king dies, there's no clear heir, and this opens the door for England's formidable king Edward I. You might know him as Longshanks. He agrees to help the Scots choose a new king, but there's a huge catch. He demands to be recognized as the feudal overlord of Scotland. He picks a guy named John Balliol, who he thinks he can control. But when Balliol inevitably tries to show a little independence, Edward invades, crushes the Scots, rips the crown from Balliol, and basically declares Scotland his personal property. And this was a total occupation. We're talking English governors crushing new taxes to pay for England's other wars, and English soldiers garrisoned in Scottish castles. For the average Scot, this wasn't some distant political drama. It was a daily humiliation. And that resentment just boiled and boiled right under the surface, creating the perfect fertile ground for a new kind of resistance to spring up. And right out of that simmering rage, 2 leaders emerged. At first they were operating on their own, but they had the exact same goal: kick the English out of Scotland. And they were a real study in contrast, these two. But together, well, they formed an incredibly powerful combination. So on one hand, you have Andrew de Moray. He's the military strategist, a nobleman from the north. He'd actually been captured by the English, but he escaped, and then systematically started retaking every English-held castle in the north. And then you have William Wallace. He was the firebrand. After an English sheriff supposedly murdered his wife, Wallace's brutal act of revenge made him a folk hero, a real rallying point for the common man. And when these two forces finally joined up, the nobleman with the plan and the knight with the fire, that's when the rebellion became a true national army. Okay, just look at the numbers here. They tell a really stark story. The Scots were outnumbered almost 2-1, but the really critical difference was the cavalry. The English had over 350 heavy horsemen. These guys were the medieval equivalent of tanks, a terrifying, basically unstoppable force on an open field. The Scots, they had just a small fraction of that. On paper, this should have been an absolute slaughter. But see, Wallace and Moray weren't planning on fighting on an open field. So, facing this Scottish army across the river, the English command was completely divided. They had a clear path to victory if they were just a little patient and a little clever. Instead, they chose to be arrogant and rash, and that decision would end up sealing their fate. You see, there was a much better option on the table. A Scottish knight who was actually loyal to the English, Sir Richard Lundy, pointed out a ford nearby where dozens of horsemen could cross at the same time and just outflank the Scots. Easy. But Hugh de Cressingham would have none of it. Now, Cressingham was the English treasurer in Scotland, a man hated by pretty much everyone for his greed. He basically goaded the old, weary Earl of Surrey, insisting they shouldn't waste time and money on fancy maneuvers when they could just smash the Scottish rabble head-on. In the end, arrogance and impatience won the day. Before the battle, the English sent a couple of guys across to demand a Scottish surrender. And this, right here, was Wallace's reported reply. It left absolutely no room for doubt. There would be no negotiations, no surrender. The message was crystal clear. If you want Scotland, you're going to have to come across this bridge and try to take it. So with the English committed to their incredibly foolish plan, Wallace and Moray got their army into position on the high ground overlooking the bridge. And they watched, and they waited. And they got ready to turn the geography of the land itself into their most powerful weapon. Patience was absolutely everything here. The crossing was just agonizingly slow. I mean, for hours, the English knights, led by Cressingham himself, just plodded across that narrow bridge, 2 by 2. The Scots just held their nerve, not moving a muscle, waiting until a big chunk of the English vanguard, we're talking around 2,000 men, including all their elite heavy cavalry, was all the way across and completely vulnerable. See, the north bank of the river formed this tight loop, creating a natural killing box. The ground was soft and marshy, just awful for heavy cavalry, who need solid ground to build up a charge. With the river at their backs and on both sides, the English vanguard had literally walked right into a cage. And then, once enough of the English were across, the signal was given. The very first Scottish move wasn't against the soldiers, but against the bridge itself. A small force raced down and seized the bridgehead, basically slamming the door shut. No one could get back out, and no one else could get in to help. Then, the main Scottish army came charging down from the high ground like an absolute avalanche. And the key to this whole attack was a formation called the Schiltron. Think of it as a dense mass of men, all armed with these 12-foot-long spears pointing outwards, like a giant hedgehog. When that wall of English heavy cavalry charged, they weren't hitting individual soldiers. They were slamming into an immovable forest of steel points. It was a complete game-changer, a way for common infantry to defeat the aristocratic knight, and it totally neutralized the single greatest English advantage. The result was a horrific, one-sided massacre. The trapped English soldiers had nowhere to go. Their knights couldn't charge, and their infantry was just completely overwhelmed by the ferocious Scottish advance. Panic set in. Some tried to fight their way back to the bridge, only to get stuck in a traffic jam of their own terrified comrades. Hundreds were pushed into the river and simply drowned under the weight of their own armor. And all the Earl of Surrey could do was watch in horror from the south bank as the very flower of his army was systematically destroyed. In just a matter of hours, it was all over. It was a victory so total, so audacious that it sent shockwaves across both kingdoms. But this incredible triumph, it came at a terrible price, and it set in motion the next, even bloodier phase of the war. The arrogant Hugh de Cressingham was pulled from his horse and killed, and the chronicles from the time report a really gruesome aftermath, claiming the Scots actually flayed his body and that Wallace had a sword belt made from his skin, a brutal message to any other invaders. Surrey fled all the way back to the English border, burning the bridge behind him and basically leaving all of Scotland in the hands of the rebels. For his part, William Wallace was knighted and made the sole guardian of Scotland. But tragically, the rebellion's strategic genius, Andrew de Moray, was mortally wounded in the battle, and his loss would be felt deeply in the fights to come. So yes, Stirling Bridge was a spectacular success. It cleared the English out of Scotland and turned William Wallace into a legend. But it was not the end, not by a long shot. When King Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, heard about this disaster, he was enraged. He immediately started putting together a new, even larger army, an army that he would lead himself. The war was really just beginning. The Battle of Stirling Bridge proved something incredible, that a smaller, well-led army using clever tactics and the terrain could beat a much larger, more powerful force. It gave the people of Scotland this incredible symbol of defiance, this belief that they could actually win. But with the full might of England now turning its vengeful gaze northward, the big question remained. Was the spirit of Stirling Bridge enough to actually forge a nation?